Hello, and welcome to this edition of Secure Networks, the Endace Packet Forensic Files, with your host, Michael Morris. This week's very special guest is our first guest on this podcast series, Justin Fier, VP of Tactical Risk and Response at Darktrace. Justin, welcome back. Thanks for joining. Why don't you, again, remind everybody a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I've been with Darktrace since days of startup. So I got to see it grow and evolve to now what's a publicly traded company and a full platform of numerous different products. And then prior to that, I supported the Intel community working on issues of counterterrorism, specifically cyber operations, as you could imagine. So, I have also had the luxury of getting to see the other side of our business.
Well, that's why really excited to have you as a guest for this edition and this episode, because we're wanting to talk about nation state security, right? Government security. There's lots of new mandates in place, and really it's becoming the new front lines, shall we say, in nation state battles and warfare. So how do you see this continuing to evolve?
So I don't think it's any surprise to anybody that, cyber tools are now a weapon in the war chest of obviously very developed, powerful nations, as well as some underdeveloped nations. It's a cheaper weapon to manufacture, right. And it's probably, in my opinion, easier to deploy. And I also would agree or suggest that it causes more damage in the long run, not necessarily kinetic, but longer term damage, economic impact, socio impact, and so I think the gloves are off. We've seen that, with what's going out on the Eastern Bloc right now. And as anybody would guess, every nation is watching that and looking at how successful that's been. And sadly, that's just the way of the future, I think, that we have to prepare for the foreseeable future, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. And you're right. The damage, could be longer lasting, and it could be, frankly, life-threatening, depending on what they're attacking, right?
Oh, yeah. Those ICS systems have a funny way of moving into the physical world.
Yeah. Well, I just look at the, even the Colonial Pipeline thing, the outage there, the drama it created in terms of gas shortages was...
I sat on those gas lines. So
I can imagine.
I remember sitting on those gas lines thinking to myself, I learned about this in school. Back in the 70s, people sitting on these gas lines waiting, what are the odds I'd get to experience that? One thing I worry about, a lot of reporters ask me what keeps me up at night. And that's just, the vulnerable state we're in right now, with oil prices being what they're at.
Yeah.
Think of what Colonial Impact had years ago when prices were stabilized. That impact now would be twofold with the high price of gasoline. So that is something that kind of worries me. It's just the vulnerable place we're in right now.
No, absolutely correct. And one of the things I want to dive a little deeper into, there obviously a lot of new security mandates coming out, being rolled out here in the US in particular, but really around the globe, to tighten cybersecurity standards for different government agencies. How can you talk about some of the highlights that you've seen and some of the things that's going on in that space?
So first and foremost, hats off to CISA. I think, what they're doing with the Shields Up program, all of the alerts they're sending out on a very, frequent basis is just phenomenal. It's about time, that we are getting this. I tell customers time and time again, watch those alerts like a hawk. That is their way of giving you classified information without giving you classified information. They're not just sending that alert out for their health. It's because they probably got some intel on something in regards to that. The other thing I'd say is the awareness coming from the White House. Politics aside, I don't care what side you sit on. I don't care what color you are. The very fact that our administration is talking about it is a huge win. Now, sometimes it's just talk and it's not enough action, and that's fine. We got to start someplace. Right. My hope is that continues for administrations to follow and we don't lose sight. Right. I know it sounds strange, but I was excited to hear, the White House talking about open source software security. Who would have thought, Granted, most of them probably didn't even know what open source meant or, the different libraries they were talking about. But the sheer fact that the conversation is happening is an absolute win, I think, on so many levels. So I think it's there. Now we just have to, put pen to paper and do something with some of this.
Well, exactly. And I complete agreement. I'm glad they're having these conversations. Do you think the mandates are enough, or where do you still see some big holes and risks? Right, we've got to get the ball moving, like you said, but are there higher risk areas in your mind?
So, I mean, if you follow the theme that's coming out of CISA, it's critical infrastructure. That is all they want to talk about. And that should raise some eyebrows.
Right.
I mean, that's what keeps the lights on and keeps our air conditionings running during these heat waves. And I think for good reason. I don't think enough people appreciate the fact that critical infrastructure is a national security threat.
Right.
Think of what your life would be like right now in Texas with 107-degree weather and no power. And I go back to that point earlier, these cyber attacks cause way more damage, kind of secondary damage than people think about, not being able to charge your electric vehicle or running air conditioning. And then there's the vulnerable population. And so, something as simple as having running water and electricity can be as detrimental as, a kinetic airstrike without being too morbid.
Absolutely. Well, not only that, the follow-on effect. Everybody's talking about supply chain issues. Imagine if the entire state of Texas was without power for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it may be.
I mean, it's a domino effect. It costs more to deliver the goods out there. I don't even have refrigerator units to put the goods in. So I don't think enough folks think of it anything more than, well, the lights will be out for a few days and we'll as a family go out and, roast marshmallows around the fire. It's going to be a lot worse than that.
Right.
So I think that is definitely an area that is still vulnerable. And we all know the talking points. It's old technology. It's still a very analog world. But on the flip side, those very talking points that have solutions, bringing them up to date, making them more digital, giving them remote access are what's introducing the vulnerabilities. So it really is a catch-22 if you think about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, where I wanted to take this too is, we see more and more foreign rogue nations in particular hiring or contracting hacker groups, right, to create or leverage various hacking techniques or malware that's already out there. And basically they're being hired as contract threat attack teams. So obviously the counter governments, our government, are going after these groups to take away their funding, right? And really a target is the cryptocurrency market. Mm-hmm. How do you see these groups evolving and expanding? And how does the cryptocurrency piece of this weigh into it?
I mean, again, you don't have to look too far past history. I mean, it's
right.
the same concept as a mercenary, it's
right.
a cyber mercenary. And in some regard, it's a better tactic to go. It's a proxy to go through. So sometimes things don't blow back against you. I think a couple things are going to happen. Sadly, I think you're going to see more of them. It's a lucrative business, and we all know that their moral compass does not necessarily follow the majority of the globes. But I do think you are seeing more nation states going after them. Now, I can't comment to what the US is doing. I can only comment what I read out in open source. But you can see just by some of the takedowns, I don't think, the FBI has ever been more public about, putting faces to people that they've identified overseas and essentially putting them on watch lists to the point where they can't travel anywhere. And that is a very big shift, I think. So I think there's a lot of work being done, probably in the classified arena. So we're not hearing as much about it as we'd like to be hearing about it. But yeah, like I said, nothing's going to change. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think we just have to shore up our defenses, both in the private sector and the federal side, to combat that.
Well, that's where I wanted to go too. On the other side of the table, right? There's a significant shortage of cyber defenders or combatants, right? To defend the nation state. What more needs to be done from your perspective in training and resourcing across the globe, right? This is not just a US problem, but to balance the number of ethical hackers and cybersecurity experts for the defensive side.
So training, education. I wish I'm going to date myself 24 years ago when I was in college, and information systems was a brand new degree at that time. There was a cyber program. My gosh, like that would be such a fascinating program to get a 4-year degree in. I don't think we're there yet, but I think I am starting to see things moving in that direction. Focusing here domestically first, pay. For instance, on the federal side, their attrition is through the roof because they're losing everybody to the private sector because they can get paid better. Again, my hat is off to CISA. They are one of the first agencies to do competitive pay. And a lot of folks said, well, that's going to throw the GS schedule on its head. And it might very well have done so, but it wasn't a few months later until the FBI was out in Congress testifying, saying, we're going to do the same thing. So they are putting the pieces in place to make it a more attractive place to work, both financially, and as a recruitment tool. Globally, that's a different story. Every nation has different resources, and different mandates. But I do agree with you. I'm tired of reading about the fact that we're in a deficit, and not to add even worse to the listeners, but I did just read a couple weeks ago that part of the great resignation that's happening right now, they're thinking a third of the cyber workforce is going to leave cyber completely due to burnout. And so It's not just pay. I think we need to look at the ones we have and figure out a way how to keep them, stop throwing more tools at a smaller team, expecting them to work longer hours and holidays, and then beating them to pieces when something gets through and breaches the network, and blaming them and only them. So I think it's twofold. It's not just hiring more, and it's retention as well.
No, that's the one thing I hear from, the security analysts I talk to is just the sheer overwhelming nature of the work, right? I mean, the volume of alarms they're trying to get through. And I read an article not too long ago about how many alarms just don't fully get investigated because they're just too many, right? Yeah. And so you're absolutely spot on the burnout front. Speaking of that, in the international cooperation, collaboration, are you seeing good cohesion between different nation states on training and resourcing as well? Are they working together from your perspective enough?
I haven't been, privy to that, but I will say is, just last week, the UK and the US announced a joint CISA, facility over in our Five Eyes partner in the UK. That's huge. I mean, that's a first of its kind. Again, that's a Five Eyes partner. So I'd love to see it in the other partners. Right. And then I think grander picture is like a NATO cyber force. Yeah. Can you imagine what would come out of all these different nations putting these bright minds in the same room together to combat these things? And so I think we're heading in the right direction. When we start talking at that level, there's so much bureaucracy and red tape, ahead that these things just take time. Which is unfortunate because we know that in our industry, we don't have time. The attackers are moving faster than ever. They're adapting to our new ways faster than ever. And so that is one area I'd like to see some change, both domestically and internationally. It's just moving faster. Yeah. We don't have the luxury of, putting an RFI out and then an RFP and then waiting 18 months to award it and then staffing up. And it's been 3.5 years before we actually deploy something. Those days have passed quite a bit.
That's you nailed my biggest concern is the speed of which cyber threats and the cyber industry changes is just still orders of magnitude at a different pace than the political arena moves.
Yeah, and I hate saying it out loud, but in reality, the defenders are not winning this battle. I mean, unfortunately, the minute we find a new way to combat them, they already have something in their pockets to combat that. And so, granted, we have to abide by laws and rules that they don't necessarily have to. But as you said, agility, we need to learn to work faster while still maintaining operational security, obviously.
Yeah, every CISO I talk to is really, it's not if you're going to be breached, it's when and how well can you retain it or contain it. And so the big buzzword I'm hearing continually is resiliency versus all out prevention.
Yeah.
So, going down that path a little bit from a solutions point of view, what are some priorities government agencies need to ensure they're adopting or implementing?
It's tough. I mean, I've been out of the government for a little while, so I don't know how they're operating now. I have to imagine, and I've read reports that there's a big push to, federal cloud environments and stuff like that. Obviously, the USG has just been pounding the zero trust concept, and for good reason. But I always tell every client I speak to, the first question is, what is your definition of zero trust? Because everybody has a different definition of it. And zero trust is not a thing, it's a concept, it's a framework. And so I think that is going to probably be the number one priority, especially as they are starting to move into more private cloud environments. That identity and management is just going to be absolutely huge to prevent the next Snowden, to prevent the next, insider from, getting access to data they shouldn't have been. And I think that's going to open up a whole new host of problems when it comes to protecting classified data and whatnot that we might not have had when we were running on more esoteric, mainframe type, systems.
No, absolutely. So, Justin, as you know, I always like to ask kind of your prognosticator question, looking out 6 to 18 months, right? If you were to say, what's one thing our listeners should really keep an eye out for in the battle for cybersecurity? What's the one thing at top of your mind?
So let's look at it from two perspectives. For the defenders, I think automation. Anywhere we can augment the humans, and I've worked for an AI-based company, so I use the word human more than I ever thought I would, because there's a very big difference between the human and the software. So try to augment them, again, to minimize that burnout and keep those folks. The other is the offense, and we're already starting to see the shift. Ransomware is not going anywhere, but as you would expect, they're going to pivot. It's getting harder for them to deploy their regular tactics. One thing that I saw recently that really worries me quite a bit is there's some intel that shows ransomware actors are focusing on more firmware now. And I don't think folks realize the danger of that, because now that gives me the ability to brick your device, not just wipe it, but brick it. And as you alluded to earlier, we're in a supply chain crisis. So if I lose 5,000 laptops, I can't just call up my sales rep and say, I need a truckload here tomorrow and I'll pay the overnight cost. They're going to tell me it's a 3-month wait because of the chip shortage. So as I mentioned earlier, the ramifications of a new colonial with the gas pipeline, the supply chain across the entire globe is what puts all of these things at risk. And so I'd say watch ransomware, because it's going to pivot, and it's going to pivot fast, and it's probably going to catch a lot of us off guard.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Justin, thanks for joining and sharing your tremendous insights in how to better secure networks. We ask our listeners to tune in next time for another edition of the Endace Packet Forensic Files. For more information about Endace's network packet capture platform and our integrations with our fusion technology partners like Darktrace, please go to endace.com. Justin, thanks again.
Thank you.
All right.